Okay, so I'm very conscious that a number of you might be thinking, why have I come to a fire conference and this guy's decided to talk about security? I think what Patrick said very earlier is buildings are incredibly complex. There's a really broad set of objectives that developers and owners and occupiers are trying to achieve. Acoustics, thermal performance, fire, and also security. And you can imagine in the last 10 years in the security world, there's been a significant increase in the demands on the performance in terms of security of buildings, largely borne by the terrorist threat that we're facing, unfortunately. So I'm going to talk to you about a piece of research funded by the BRE Trust that has led to a new certification scheme in the area of security risk management. I thought I'd throw a picture of me in here when I had hair. That was literally about 3 weeks ago. It's depressing. It's probably the last time I can ever use it, so savour this moment. I do have a background actually in fire. I'm a chartered fire engineer, and that's where I had my first career, working for BRE as a fire engineering consultant. Obviously that makes me quite comfortable speaking to the audience that we have today. And I think what's really useful is I can see, and I've learned a lot from the fire side that's influenced my work in security, because they're surprisingly similar disciplines. So what is Sabre? So it's, first of all, it's an acronym, Security Assurance by BRE. If anyone's familiar with BREEAM, which is the Sustainability Rating Scheme for buildings and infrastructure, this is very similar in terms of the way it's delivered. And the idea is that we're looking to obviously reduce security risks for asset owners, operators and occupiers. We're looking to improve transparency and provide assurance. You'd be surprised at how lacking in transparency the security industry is. You know, the fact that people are able to hide behind the threat and the classified nature of the threat means that very often people put in a lot of investment into security, but they're unable to see any kind of idea of the return that they're getting for that, because people always resort to, well, it's classified, we can't share that information, and so on. That's been a major issue, which, to be honest, has been to the detriment of performance-based design. The other thing that we're looking to do is, because of the nature of the security, in that it deals with not only life safety, and I know fire is the same, but we're thinking about property protection, business continuity, and so on. It's really important that people understand why they're investing, what their objectives are, and sometimes people need to be very clear on what the reward is. So we're looking through certification to offer new rewards that have not been available to developers and owner-occupiers previously, and that encourages them to obviously invest more to improve performance in the built environment. So just as a quick overview, this scheme works both in new construction and in the in-use stage of buildings. So essentially you can gain certification at both of those stages. And in terms of why we've developed this scheme, there's a whole set of questions that were basically unanswered through the life cycle of a building. Now I'll start off, the principal stages shown here are the planning and design stage of an asset, the commissioning, construction and handover, and then the operations or in-use phase. And what I'll do after this slide is draw some comparisons to fire safety. So the kind of questions that we were being asked, and the Home Office presented to us when they asked us to look at this issue of security risk management, is basically at that very early stage of planning and designing a new development, people are asking what security do they need. Now you see that in fire safety as well. People say, is it just life safety? Is it property protection? Do I have to think about the environment? Do I have to think about operational performance? And you start to see asset classes like airports, railway stations, all those kind of places where those factors become really important, where picking up ADB just simply isn't the answer. And security is even worse. Can you imagine the difficulty you've got in understanding what your threat is? You know, this is human-based, this is malevolent threat, so we're having to deal with circumstances that are very dynamic. The second we put a control measure in, someone's trying to go around that. So it makes our job as engineers, scientists, and so on, incredibly difficult. And it means that we've really got to be on the ball of keeping up to date with the most recent challenges. Another surprising question at the outset of a project is, who's responsible for security? Might seem obvious. Some people will say, well, it's the police, they look after us, don't they? Or the security services. But is it the insurer? Does he have any role whatsoever to play in how secure the buildings are that they insure? Do they have any duty of care in offering insurance? Is it the owner? Is it the tenant? Is it the managing agent? There's a lot of people involved. Is it the architect at the outset of a project? Is it the security consultant, or is it everybody? And if it's everybody, who's defining what those objectives are, and how do we ensure that when we get to the phase of being in use that we've met those objectives? So we're trying to address those kinds of issues from the outset. And obviously that's incredibly difficult when you've got speculative build. If you don't know who's going to be in the building at the end of the day when it's in use, let's be fair, if BRE is in a building, people are probably not targeting as much as they would Goldman Sachs or a government agency. So you might think, well, what does that mean? Do we have to change the infrastructure of the building, up-spec that, or can we deal with those changes in terms of operational and the manning aspects of security? When we go into the construction, commissioning and handover, we meet the next set of challenges, and typically that's around the practice of value engineering. Because I said there's a lack of transparency in decision making for security, what's the first thing that a developer is going to take out of their project when they hit the buffers on the cost overruns and so on? Well, it's going to be security. And it's exactly what I would do if it was unclear of why I'm putting in CCTV, a fence or a wall or access control. I'm probably going to take that out first before I take out the fire safety measures and so on, because to be honest, I'll probably get away with it. We have the other issue as well of people just doing what they've done in the last project, regardless of what the needs are on the current. So, you have a situation where contractors will completely ignore what's in the design documentation, and they said, well, I did a hotel last year, we just stuck CCTV in, so we'll stick CCTV in this time, because it'll probably work. Obviously, this goes again back to what Patrick was saying earlier, that we have a systems problem. It's not easy to whip out one component and expect the same performance at the end of the day. CCTV has a very specific function in terms of a security strategy. It provides you with a degree of deterrence because people see cameras and so on, so it can deter people from conducting an act at your facility. It can provide an opportunity for detection, but it absolutely does not deny somebody entry to your building. It doesn't delay entry, it just gives you a lovely photo of them entering your building. So it's not as simple as saying, take that component out, we've got other bits. They're all quite important in understanding the overall performance, and we've got to think about it holistically, and that's been lacking in the security industry until this product. When we get into operations, it gets even more complicated. We've got lots more humans involved in the process now. And very often we find that these poor end users have no idea why there are these physical and technical measures around their building. And I know that in fire safety, with the requirements to provide information to end users now, that issue has been largely resolved, although you could argue with recent incidents, it's still not appropriate. So we see incidences where a shopping centre manager says, why is that camera above that door? Why have I got those bollards outside? Could I keep them down or do I have to raise them? They really need that information to be absolutely clear of what the design requirement was, what threat has been designed for, what measures have been put in response, what consequences were anticipated, and all of that, all the way through to the in-use phase. And we're trying to improve that through better documentation. That question of who is responsible reappears. Again, it's not always obvious. If you're a landlord of a building, you probably have control over the common areas, certainly of the exterior spaces, perimeter walls, external CCTV, but you have no idea what people are storing in their building. You don't know necessarily whether that presents an increased risk for other tenants in the building. You don't know whether it presents a risk to others in the building, whether they represent a security breach, whether their own people are following the procedures that they should do in terms of gaining access to the building and so on. And then you get a kind of a strange situation in security where if nothing's happened for a while, and I guess to a lesser extent in fire, but it could be true, people say, well, nothing's happened, so are we now overspending on security? Well, that might just be proving that you're doing a good job of his security. So by improving transparency, we're trying to take away kind of that issue where people start to lower their investment and then suffer consequences as a result of it. There's the whole procurement issue of people outsourcing security and thinking that they've passed the buck to someone else. So, when someone puts out a tender for man guarding services, no, you haven't outsourced security. You've just, procured services for someone to assist you. You still need to define what the objectives are. You still need to monitor performance. You still have the duty of care to the tenants, your staff, and visitors, and so on. And then the ultimate question, is security effective at a building? How do you actually measure that? Is it loss statistics? Is it the fact that you haven't had a breach? Or were you just lucky? Were they not targeting you at the time? So there's a lot of KPIs that you might have to look at and consider when assessing how well you're performing. A quick jump over to this kind of the fire world. If you think of all those questions I've just asked, I always say that kind of fire is about 10 years, a decade ahead of security in terms of risk management and understanding that kind of risk assessment process. Fire safety order was 2007, if I'm not correct. Yep, think it was 2007 that came out. There's nothing like that in the security world, but these questions are still being asked. I said at the beginning, risk ownership and clear responsibilities. Dame Hackett said in her personal kind of view of the situation that she felt that that wasn't clear at the moment, and that's certainly the case in security. People need to be focused on outcomes rather than blindly following prescriptive guidance. Again, this is still a situation, it sounds, in the fire world as it is in security. A big issue in security is there is very little prescriptive guidance, and it means that we rely on having competent people to deliver solutions that can prove effectiveness. And again, this issue of professionalising the industry hasn't been there while there's been a lack of transparency, and that's, by the sound of it, a case still in the fire industry that there are issues. The need for a risk-based approach, both in design and also enforcement activities. Again, in security, we don't have that, and by the sound of it, there's still challenges in the fire industry. And then transparency of information and an audit trail. We want to make sure when somebody makes a decision at the very start of a project, people can understand kind of what implications that has later on and be held to account if it was the wrong decision. So what does this mean? Well, in the world of security, we always hear that security is a grudge purchase. Quite understandably, if you can see the cost of something but you can't understand the benefits, you're going to be reluctant to spend that money. So what we're trying to do on this kind of graph on the right-hand side, it's showing kind of the maturity of approach on the x-axis and the number of organisations. And no surprise, there are some organisations that we're the bulk in the middle where they kind of meet in regulatory standards, or maybe not, because there's very few in security. But we're trying to push them across to the right-hand side so that they get more benefit out of their security, and that's what we're doing with this scheme. And what we're saying is we're turning a grudge purchase into a growth purchase by making sure that people see security as an investment, so they can see the returns, there's transparency and visibility of that, and that basically they maximise the benefit out of adopting a systematic approach to risk management. Because again, that's very piecemeal at the moment, and you see a massive range of kind of approaches taken across industry. So, does any of that really matter? So I thought I'd throw a few interesting things up. We have a massive problem in the security industry of what we call security theatre. So people spend a massive amount of money on the stuff that you can see, the physical infrastructure on a building. They believe that if you can show a capital expenditure in security by putting in shiny new cameras, the latest technology, you've done what you can't be held account if you've done that. The issue is a lot of that security actually adds no value whatsoever. Here's an example of a building, a real-life building that shall absolutely remain unnamed, with a checkpoint that's been put outside because of terrorism issues. So the idea is this is a temporary, although it's been there a while now, search area for people entering this museum building. Before I say any more, this operation costs £400,000 a year for the museum. So you can imagine if you're not going to get any results out of this, as a curator, you're going to probably be pretty annoyed because that's taken £400,000 out of your budget to buy artwork and so on. So anyway, this is a man guarding company, and the idea is that your legitimate users come in through the front gate, they walk about 100 metres down the courtyard, they go through this laborious searching process, have a quick look in your bag, all of that kind of thing, and then they nicely walk back along the 100 metres back towards the entrance and they go in. So on appearance, you think, oh great, they're doing something, that's fantastic. But of course, if you're not a legitimate kind of aggressor or actor, then what you're going to do is probably just go directly around that security measure. It doesn't take long for one person who has an ill intent against this building to go through that process and realise, actually, there's an alternative route. It's the dotted red line, which is simply around a tensor barrier. You know, those little things you have to stop you jump in the queue in the post office or whatever. You just pull that and through you go. Now, I'm unlikely, if I've got a machine gun in my bag or a bomb or whatever, to go through the 100-metre journey through the search. Why would I? I'd have to be insane, wouldn't I? You could argue they're insane anyway, but literally you would go on the red route. So what, in terms of the outcome, does it deter me? Doesn't take much to remove that deterrence value. And then does it provide any real protection against that type of attack? Absolutely not. And it's cost a lot of money. So these are the kind of theatre, the theatrical side of security that we're looking to remove. That money can be better spent elsewhere. The other thing that's important, obviously, is that we have to look at whole life costs. typically buildings are spending around 1 to 2% of capital expenditure on security measures. They're the ones, kind of the elements that are very easy to pull out, things like access control, CCTV. It's a big investment. You get one shot to do that, and it's when you're building an asset. If you get it wrong at that stage, and this is why we've introduced certification at the design and construction stage, you will probably never get that opportunity again. You'll get a refit opportunity, but you'll only be looking at one component. If you get it wrong at that stage, your operational cost is going to be hit massively forever. And what's surprising, and I'll show you on the next slide some data, is that around 5 to 25% of operating costs in the built environment is attributable directly to security. Now, just to give you a flavour for what that means, that is actually larger than any energy costs in buildings. So what we see is end users spending significant capital sums to improve energy performance because they see a whole life benefit in doing so. When was the last time you saw somebody invest in a significant amount in refurbing or upgrading their security to get a whole life benefit? You don't see it, and yet 20% of their budget is going on security, and they can't attribute a value to that. So you may as well just stick it down the drain and not bother. So these are really important issues. Oops, sorry, jumped a slide there. The other thing that's important is that consumers are increasingly concerned about security. We conducted a survey last year looking at how security issues influence people's behaviours in terms of where they go to stay, which properties they buy, kind of venues they use, and so on. What that data showed us is that 2/3 of people, unsurprisingly due to media coverage of terrorism, are more concerned now than they were 5 years ago. And their top 3 concerns were cybercrime, terrorism, and property crime. And by that I'm talking about theft or burglary from homes and offices and so on. So again, probably not a surprise, but what was really important for our kind of research is to understand, well, if we were able to communicate to people the good endeavour, the good work that venues are doing to make themselves more secure, to reduce crime, fear of crime, and so on, would there be a benefit to the end users? Because ultimately, when you adopt certification, you're looking for a payback on this. So we've got to sell this idea of improving performance, not just go out there with kind of this mission for the greater good. And what we were able to show is that 65% of people, security, when they're going through Expedia or whatever, there are other sites, of course, when they're looking to make their decisions on hotels, they're influenced by security. They're looking to understand how secure that venue is when they take their family or go on a corporate stay. 84% are considering security when they're purchasing or renting a property. So, if we're able to provide some way that a developer can get recognised for the good work that they've done in security risk management, that badge will be rewarded by people being more likely to buy that property, more likely to tenant that space, and so on. So there's a definite payback we can see over time, and that ultimately means that the asset is more valuable, because if people are more likely to tenant it, then obviously you'll get better yields and longer tenancy periods. So this kind of work was very reassuring that we're kind of heading in the right direction. In terms of what we're assessing with this scheme, what we don't do is tell anybody what measures they should put in. As I mentioned earlier, the measures that are appropriate for one location will absolutely be different to another. What goes in for one building occupied by one end user might be completely inappropriate for another. So what we have to think about, we have to be a bit clever. It's not about prescription. It's not saying you're going to have CCTV, you're going to have a fence. This is about looking at the process of risk management. And that's shown by this cycle, essentially. And what the scheme looks at is, whether it's at the design phase and construction or in use, is whether they've gone through essentially this Deming's wheel, these 4 stages, where they've been absolutely clear about what they're trying to achieve. So that's defining their requirements, that they've actually taken a holistic approach to putting a security plan or strategy together, that they've gone to the effort of then actually implementing that plan and then monitoring their performance against that plan. And clearly that never ends. And what we've created here is a situation where we can hold people account through the life of a building for demonstrating that they're keeping this up to date. We obviously had to turn that cycle into a standard and a scheme document to permit certification. And essentially what that shows itself as is a series of sections here. I'll cover the kind of the three big categories, which are kind of complementary with those stages. So defining facility security requirements, that takes into account two really important aspects. So that's understanding the facility in its context. When is it used? Who uses it? Where is it? What are the operational hours? All of those kinds of things. Understanding the risks that those factors or those attributes attribute. So that's exactly the same as the kind of the chart that you would use in performance-based design for fire. So understanding what the kind of the potential sources of fire and so on are, and what the potential consequences are. Then looking for evidence that they've put together their security strategy, that strategy deals with planning issues, so spatial orientation on a site, where the buildings are, size, orientation, that deals with issues like material selection, because they have a major impact on the impact due to blast and things like that. That they've thought about the technical and physical aspects of security. So those are the common measures you'd see, which are things like access control, intruder detection systems, fencing, walls, and so on. And then that they've also aligned that with a management plan. Now, I don't know kind of what the status is with approved document B currently, but it used to be, it's incredibly heavy, obviously, on physical and technical measures, whether that be compartmentation, detection, and so on. But it's not heavy on operations. There's not I know that 9999 kind of covers this, where you start to say, what's the assumption in relation to management? In security, it's absolutely key that you understand how a building is to be operated, because if you get the people and procedural aspects wrong, everything else you've done is a waste of time, because ultimately it's a system that we're looking at. And in the last section of the scheme, which is kind of 3 components, is all about implementation and change management. So we're looking at how they manage incidents and the recovery process should something happen, the overall management system in terms of continuity, in terms of top management leadership, culture, policies, procedures, and then change management, where if something changes, new occupants, refurbishments, anything like that, how they've addressed that. And the scheme is aligned to ISO 31000, which covers risk management. Also the British Standard on Security Code of Practice, and also then it's aligned with obviously the REBA process, so that people know how they deliver that through the life cycle of a building. If you are interested in looking further into this, we've created the Loss Prevention Standard 2082, which covers all of the key components that we're actually certifying people against. And what people end up with is not just a certificate, but a rating to understand how well they're performing in the market in general. Now in certification, in terms of driving performance, one of the key things we have to do is we have to make one person look better than another, so that they get jealous and then they go along that path of improving over time. And that's what these ratings do. What it doesn't say is if you're an outstanding building, it doesn't say that you are absolutely kind of impregnable in terms of a security incident. What it means is you're in the top 1% in terms of your performance in the market. I'd only expect to see 1 in 100 buildings having gone to such a level of effort and performance. And then that slide in scale against that kind of curve is shown there. And obviously we only reward the top 50% of performers. We don't obviously reward people who are below average in terms of their performance. So in the case of some buildings, good is good enough. For some people, outstanding would be the minimum you'd expect. And you could imagine the types of buildings you'd place up in the outstanding level, probably airports, probably nuclear facilities and so on. Probably unlikely that we'd have to achieve outstanding on this site. But what drives you in terms of understanding where you should be is the ability to benchmark. If every building in the City of London that's a commercial office that's being rented by the blue chips is excellent, you will probably, as a developer, want to be thinking about achieving excellent, because otherwise everybody's going to look at you and say, well, you're not as good as everyone else. So you can start to see how this becomes competitive, and then over time we update the standards to drive performance and make it harder to achieve those higher levels. I'm getting away from Debbie at the front, so I'm running out of time, but essentially what it means is that whereas before there was never a defined role for a security consultant in a project, with the scheme we've introduced, there's absolutely the reward for doing that. If you are involved in projects, you probably do see security consultants involved these days, certainly in the bigger schemes, just because of the complexity of the issue and the impact it can have on other design disciplines. So obviously there's an obvious link between security and fire there, where we're looking to lock exits, and potentially on the far side there's a need to obviously ensure people can get out. So that's a simple example, but it extends to material choices and everything else. In terms of where people can get certification, there's an opportunity to kind of lock in performance at the end of technical design. That can be used to support planning applications. It can be used in contracts to ensure a contractor is held to account against that certification standard. Then we do it at the end of the project, a practical completion, just to ensure that what has been implemented represents what was in the design. Again, that's quite useful for planners, very useful for contract documents and so on. Very useful for the security consultant as well, to be able to prove that he's done a good job on security. Because imagine, it's very difficult to procure consultancy services when you say, well, provide me with security. Well, what does that mean? It means different things to different people. So this, actually, by saying you will achieve an excellent rating, when they get the certificate, they can release payment. So it kind of encourages good performance, even down in the supply chain as well. And then obviously there's the in-use elements of certification. I can kind of finish the presentation on this slide where I've tried to draw a really basic comparison. And I know if you look in Dame Hackett's review, there's a massive drawing in there and saying what's going on in the fire industry and who's regulating and so on. But in a nutshell, you know, at that early stage in terms of design and construction, to draw a comparison, your criteria are essentially in the building regulations with the functional performance requirements, and that's supplemented by the approved documents. The enforcers, or the assurance that that's been implemented, is afforded by the building control process, whether that be the local authority or approved inspectors and the fire service. And then when you go into the in-use phase, you've obviously got the fire safety order, and you've got PAS 7, which is the the fire risk management standard for certification. And then that's being enforced by fire and rescue services and certification bodies. Now in the security world, to be honest, probably an inappropriate word, but we've got fluff. What are the security requirements for a building? There's no approved document for commercial buildings, absolutely no requirement in the building regulations for security, and yet it's pretty fundamental to life safety, for certain types of building anyway. In use phase, there's a whole raft of legislation, so you can try and hang security off the Health and Safety at Work Act, the Occupiers Liability Act, data protection, or its latest kind of version. There's absolutely an array, but nothing actually says what is required, and until you've had a breach and been taken to court, you don't know whether the measures that you put in were appropriate. So we're trying to change that, and we're doing that by introducing our scheme criteria at those two phases. And as I said, this is about the process you should go through, who should be involved, what deliverables you should expect, and what outcomes are they trying to achieve. It doesn't tell you the specific measures to put in. And where do you get your assurance from? Well, in this scheme, you've got your Sabre assessor, that's a third party who's not involved in the design process or the operation of the building. And then BRE, like in BREEAM, acts as the certification body to ensure that the outcomes from the certification scheme are consistent across the country or across the world, wherever it's used. So that gives you a flavour for how we see security moving in the future. There's a range of benefits, but I will just close on this slide. These are some of our early adopters that we've got, and we announced this week, literally. It's a year old, the scheme. We announced our first certified in-use building this week, which was International Quarter London, which is an absolutely massive development next to the Olympic Park. And we're starting to see now this traction developing and people picking up the scheme and realising that there are major benefits to be had from addressing security in a kind of a systematic and risk-based way. And on that note, thank you very much for letting me speak at your conference.